Good morning. I'm Jim Mowat and I am the convener of Unite's Environment Task Force. Now, today our topic is vast and it's three-dimensional and it's only a springboard. It's a springboard into tons of future activities within our union and with other organisations, some of which are with us today. International Union of Food Workers, the Global Labour Institute, the Greener Jobs Alliance, and the trade unions for environment and energy democracy are joining us from New York. So what we're trying to do is seek solutions to the climate crisis which confronts all of us. Now, my ambition as the chair is to give space to as many contributors as possible. So I'll be asking you throughout for questions and observations. Now, we're going to have a comfort break at 10:45 to 1100 hours, and I'll be bringing down the curtain at noon sharp to finish the event. But I want to maximise debate, and to do that, I'm handing you over to my colleague Nathan, and Nathan will take us through the House rules. Nathan?
Hi there. Okay, so I'd just like to read out some very quick housekeeping rules for you today. Firstly, the conference, this is a webinar style format. This means that you can't turn on your webcam or microphone like a normal Zoom meeting. However, we do want to hear your questions. There will be many chances to ask the questions throughout the conference. For this, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, where a member of our team will be collecting all the questions for you. We will try to get through as many questions as we can today. However, we do understand that every question is important, and that's why if we don't get around to answering your question, we'll follow up post-conference. This conference is being recorded. Please be aware, however, the only people that are on this conference that are being recorded will be our guest speakers. And due to the large demand of this conference, we're also live streaming this conference across Facebook and Twitter. So a big hello to our social media viewers out there watching. If you do require closed captions, then these are available down below by clicking the closed captions CC live transcript button and then clicking subtitles. And finally, we ask that you apply the Unite values of equality, dignity, and respect in all your contributions and conversations today. It's been a great pleasure to support this conference and making it available to so many people. I'm now going to pass over and we're going to watch a Unite Environment film.
Climate change equals workplace change.
It means changes in our communities and our homes.
It also means change for our environment and a sustainable future for our children.
The health of our nation depends on the health of our planet.
Trade union voices must lead the conversation and make sure that national and local governments listen and act.
Our country runs like a machine.
And at the core of each part of the machine are the workers.
Whether gathering resource, processing materials,
distributing goods and services, or handling how we manage our waste.
Nothing happens without us, and we are the key to the success of our society.
With your help, our union will defend and promote the interests of workers,
ensuring we remain at the core through the Green Revolution.
That we are part of the process to drive it forward.
And that our values remain at the forefront.
We want to see our skills and experience used every step of the way.
We want to choose how we adapt and improve our skills.
We want to shape these workplaces of the future to deliver safe, well-paid, sustainable jobs.
In sustainable workplaces and communities and on a sustainable planet.
So, whether we fly,
transport,
ship,
engineer,
build,
extract,
power,
heal,
grow,
we do it together.
We do it together.
We do it together.
We do it together.
Climate change at your work, your home, your community.
We need to use nature's inexhaustible sources of energy.
Sun, wind, and tide.
And we need to use workers' power.
A great source of energy.
To help us tackle climate change.
Get involved and help us shape our future.
Together.
I'm really proud to send this message supporting Unite's Environment Charter. We know we're in the decisive decade when it comes to the climate crisis. We know what we do in the next few years will have an impact on the next few hundred years. We've got to act, and we've got to act with urgency. But it's not just about what we do to avoid disaster. It's also about the better world we can create, the fairer world we can create, the better jobs, unionized jobs that we can create, better air, better transport systems, green spaces, all of the things that we can do. But I know this, workers and unions have got to be at the center of this transition. Your voice, your interests, us working together. And that's why the involvement of Unite in the fight against the climate crisis is so important. That's why the involvement of trade unions in the fight against the climate crisis is so important. And I say this, no worker should be left behind. No worker will be left behind if a Labour government is in power overseeing this transition. That is my guarantee to you. And we all know what we need. We need a Green New Deal, which provides the investment, which provides the jobs, which provides the fairness. And I look forward to working with you to make it happen.
Smashing. And that was Ed Miliband, who leads for Labour in the Westminster Parliament on the energy and the environment. Can I just go over to Sakina Sheikh? Sakina is one of our major activists. Sakina, please.
Thanks so much, Jim. And yeah, what an exciting morning to have been joining. As you said, I'm a Unite activist. I'm also a member of the London Assembly, and it's been such an awesome privilege to be part of the environmental task force that's helped put this kind of conference together to bring people in Unite, but people outside of Unite together to talk about how exactly we can lead the climate transition. Because I think, you know, what we just heard from Ed was spot on, right? We are in a decisive decade for action. And what we actually need in this decade is economic transformation. That's going to be at the heart of everything. And I think this is exactly what the unions have known for a long time. But finally, I think people are waking up to the wider context that we're in, which is actually like we've got a rotten economic system, and that's led us to a climate crisis. And actually, you know, whether that's the ocean being on fire, like we've seen videos of recently, or floods at our doorsteps, or in global south countries for decades actually that have had these fires, that have had these floods, that have been hunted down by fossil fuel companies. It's a rotten economic system that's given us the climate crisis, and it's a rotten economic system that actually the unions have been fighting for decades. And we saw that even in the pandemic, right? We saw the fact that whether it was construction workers, Deliveroo drivers, or key workers, you know, they were the last to lock down and the first to be sent back out. Some of them never were even given the chance to lock down. And I think that's because actually this government really showed its hand in that they are very happy to sacrifice working class communities. In fact, Boris said, let the bodies pile up. And I think that's exactly the attitude of the climate crisis that has, you know, fossil fuel companies have been making their profit while it's been frontline communities that have been sacrificed. So this context of kind of sacrificing working class communities, we have to, you know, we have to show that actually it's a trade union movement at the heart that's been pushing back on this aggressive economic agenda, and it's the same economic agenda that's led to the climate crisis. And making that intersection is what I think will continue to give Unite the place that it rightly should have, which is right at the center of defining how we transition from high carbon industries to low carbon industries, because absolutely not will we have our jobs sacrificed so that fossil fuel companies can glean off the profit of this climate crisis? So I think we are in a very decisive decade, and I think Unite is doing an incredible and very powerful role in defining what that transition looks like. How do we ensure that, as Ed and Jim have said, no worker is left behind? How do we ensure that actually the jobs for the future are unionised, long-term, sustainable, and they're done on our terms? So I think, although we do feel like a time of crisis, at the climate crisis and economic crisis coming out of a pandemic, is also a huge moment for opportunity, and that opportunity has to be defined by Unite, by our members, and by the people that we represent in those workplaces who will be the jobs of the future and the workers of the future, and it has to be done on our terms. So I think convening this conference, Jim, has been, such a, how can I put this, a continuation of what Unite has done, which is show leadership in this conversation, how we create this transition and we make it just. And I think it's so fantastic that we've got 438 people that have had their coffee this morning and joined us online to continue defining this conversation. So I think my kind of question, I think, to you and to Barry, if he's joined us on this call, the kind of key question I wanted to ask is, given that we face these huge challenges, but it also presents these huge opportunities, how do we get this out to our Unite members? What is Unite doing to ensure that we're getting this message out and bringing people together to have this conversation? So yeah, I look forward to continuing to be part of that conversation, and really interested to hear how we continue to make it grow and bring as many people in as possible. Cheers, Jim.
Thanks so much, Sakina. That was brilliant, and what a great uplifting start to the event, to the conference. I think you raise a really important question, and I think it's probably the one that's central to us as an education department in terms of how we get the message out. So what we have been doing already is we've been talking to lots of our groups, our committees, our combines, our branches, and we've also been shaping education courses. Everything from a short 90-minute introduction and awareness to the question of the environment, through to 1, 3 and 5 day courses on the environment. All of those will be advertised in due course on the education part of the website. I think there's a link that someone has put into the chat here that people can have a look at. That's mainly for our activists, but there'll also be awareness sessions that we're opening up as well. There'll be a lot of work done around our representatives, getting them to start to look at auditing their workplaces, getting them to look at raising these questions with their employers at the bargaining table, and getting them to look at all the other aspects of how the environment intersects with other agendas and policy issues within the union. So this is an incredibly important time for us, and I think that we're prepared for it. We've done a lot of work to get to this stage, and hopefully all of the people who are listening here can join us on the journey that we're on here, both educationally and also just to try and reshape what we're doing. And
I think Barry's now employing telepathy to get his message over. I take it it's frozen over in Arctic Stockton on Tees. So we'll just continue. There's questions popping up. They want to pick up some of the responses to the questions that are coming in. Who wants to take on that? Well, I'll take on one. There's one that says that this is going to be disruptive. Here's my view on this. I think the environmental debate is a class issue, and I think it's poor people and people on low incomes that are going to take a real belting on this. And the two examples that stick at a mile where I'm based in, which is Bermondsey in southeast London, is going to be replacing gas-fired boilers in domestic homes and also replacing cars. And we reckon it'll cost maybe £10,000 to replace a gas boiler system, no matter what's going to come in, either hydrogen or whatever. And also, as cars move from diesel and petrol, that's going to be a big impact on people's disposable income. And we need to be able to force the government into helping people make that transition. And I think it was Martha that said it would be disruptive. I think it's going to be exceedingly disruptive. And it impacts on our members in two ways. One, it impacts on their jobs, no matter where we are. And it'd be interesting if Siobhan and Dean wish to come in this, because Siobhan's representing the not-for-profit. Because when you have this discussion, lots of people think it's about Swarfigas and oil rigs and steel, glass, cement. This is a debate that impacts on every single person as a worker and as a citizen and their families. So that's why I said at the beginning, it's a vast debate and this is only a springboard. Siobhan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. I think, you know, the issue about the question that was asked is that we need to be honest about climate change, and a just transition is going to be disruptive to the economy, I think is a really interesting and important question. And what we need to see in a just transition is that the change that's required to reduce carbon emissions needs to be based around investment in jobs and in green jobs. And so, you know, in the not-for-profit sector, of course, we want to see the retrofitting of all social housing to make sure that they are insulated, and that does require investment, and it also requires a plan, and it requires a government and local authorities to make sure that they are investing in that. But also it's about the skills agenda, so it's about making sure that we have the workforce skilled up, trained, effectively accredited for the work that needs to be done to make all of those changes. So this is an important agenda for our union across all industrial sectors. And we believe that the best people to identify the plan for the sector are our members who work in that sector. And that's why this charter for a green transition, the Unite Charter for the environment, is so important. It's about empowering our reps at the workplace, making sure that we have the voice to put together, and we have the expertise to put together that plan for how we reduce carbon emissions in our workplaces and in our sectors, but also having our political voice to say, actually, it is not just about us. It is about having a government that is alive to the fact that we need to reduce carbon emissions and meet not net growth, zero carbon emissions, to make sure that we are meeting that challenge. So I think there was another question that was asked about whether or not we reach out to other organisations beyond trade unions, and I think we absolutely do. And in the not-for-profit sector, we organise workers who work in environmental charities and campaigning organisations, and we are part of our great union. But also we do build those kind of alliances across the trade union movement, but beyond, in order to address these issues. But what's inspired me, Jim, is the level of awareness and understanding of the complexities of the need for us to address that has been demonstrated in the chat and also in the Q&A. And I think it's fantastic to hear the contributions that have been made this morning. We don't have all the answers, do we, Jim? I don't think. But we are beginning the conversation and, demonstrating how we see this as a living and growing agenda in our union.
Thank you for that, Siobhan. Now, I don't know if Barry's still with us or if he's in the frozen north. If not, can I bring in Colin? Colin Potter is our senior researcher on this issue, and will be a leading person at COP26 in Glasgow in 7 weeks. And he wants to stay in Govan Hill. Colin.
I don't know about staying in Govan Hill, but I'm certainly going to be at the climate change talks. Just to highlight that hopefully I will be able to speak to the UN directly at the talks and raise the issues that are dear to our hearts, including things like just transition, changes to the workplace requirements, so that effectively everybody has got a maximum temperature that they can work it within, so that there's not a situation whereby people have to work in environments which are certainly not conducive to their health in any way, and effective a change, which is obviously going forward would actually deal with a lot of the changes that are happening in the workplace. I'm obviously happy to work with anybody out there to actually help drive down emissions within the workplace and help them, if at all possible, achieve a green transition. And that's what we need to see, a green transition going forward. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah. Okay. Jackson, do you want to just bring us up to speed on where we are? Jackson's High Hegian in Scotland for us on this topic. Jackson?
Thanks, Jim. I noticed on the questions in the chat, there's a couple of people asking about whether we'll encourage branches to participate in COP26. And indeed we will. We're just waiting for the final sort of programme of events, but I can tell you now that the main demonstration day will be Saturday the 6th of November. If you go on the COP26 Coalition website, there's an interactive map which will give you details of the activities in your own areas, but they all are tending time-wise to coincide with the main demonstration in Glasgow. So a 12 o'clock start and a 3 o'clock rally. In terms of Glasgow, that will be from Kelvingrove Park to Glasgow Green. But there will also be other events. On the Friday preceding the big demonstration, the STUC will be organising a trade union sort of fringe event for the COP. And in the following week, there will be a number of events. I know that Caitlin's here, so there'll be an event specifically for Unite Hospitality, which is quite frankly taking advantage of the fact that international visitors will be using the hospitality in Glasgow to push for our Hospitality Workers Charter. We're also looking at the potential for an event on the 10th around public transport, because we know that the COP itself will be discussing that. And I know that there's a question in the chat in relation to this. Certainly in Scotland, we've got a campaign that's been launched and is really gathering momentum. It's now got the support of a range of organisations, the Poverty Alliance, One Parent Families and Gender, campaigning for the municipal ownership of buses in Scotland. We have won the right to municipally owned buses through Unite's pressure to get amendments to the Transport Act, but the Scottish Government haven't provided councils with the finance to enable them to do that. So there's a big push on this issue. I know that in England, there's a push on the regulation of public transport franchising because you don't have the municipal power. So that is one of the three key messages from the Scottish Trade Union movement for COP. It's about public transport, municipal ownership of it, retrofitting of houses, which links into one of the other questions about working with councils in this. And the third one is to address the question of renewables, because quite frankly, the promised jobs bonanza in renewables has not occurred. And we really need to be pushing on this for more investment to be done in this, and actually some better ownership as well. It's ironic that the renewable jobs that have been produced, certainly in Scotland, are all going to publicly owned companies, but they're publicly owned companies in other countries. So we have this, crazy situation where, things are being shipped, out with Scotland, back into Scotland, and contributing to the whole climate change agenda, supposedly in an effort to address it. So thanks, Jim. Sorry for taking up so much time, but I thought we'd try and kill a couple of birds with one stone, as they say, in terms of some of the questions that's been posed. Thanks.
Good. So we want the questions and the contributions to pour in, and we'll be responding to them. And those ones which we can't respond to on camera, we'll respond in writing by the end of the week. That's a wee commitment that we're giving to all the people that are contributing and asking questions. Now, have we got Steve Craig?
Yeah, Jim, with you.
Right, Steve, who do you want to bring in? What questions have been asked that you think?
Yeah, there were just a couple of ones. One centrally around, is the film available? We just ask Joan or Lynette to post up the link into the Learn With Unite website. Just stress to colleagues on that one, the film is there, the film that we've just seen, but also there's a landing page for Unite activity, both in terms of education, but also quite a massive archive of resources for reps, which will include everything from policies to toolkits, links to websites and other films, which these are going to be the resources that in part support our education work, but also can be utilized and bespoke by reps at local level, because there's a vast array of materials there. So that was just that on the film. Also, there was a question from someone who was anonymous about how can they get involved. As has already been said, I mean, Barry pointed to the platform of activity that we will develop on the education program. So I'd encourage you to look both regionally and nationally at the education program being available. And also using the Learn With Unite website, we'll post as much activity, resources and tools up on that site as we can. So it's about very much not this being a top-down process, but this being one that reps have ownership of, that our combined committees have ownership of, and the regions both right across our structure, from local branches to regional committees to our NISCs, that they get involved in picking up this agenda. We've prepared a number of presentations and we've spoken to the risks in NISCs. At present, we've got a platform opportunity for people to attend risks that are going to be rolled out. We can post that information up as well onto the chat. But one point I'd just like to mention, Jim, a number of people have identified retrofit as being a central component to our approach. There are some excellent examples of retrofit, but we almost need to develop a retrofit army. We've not got at present at local level on many councils the workforces to do this, and we need to expand that workforce. Again, locating this around not just climate change, but in our transition, that these jobs are decent jobs, that this is decent work. And we're looking at everything from net zero apprentices supporting and engaging around this activity, all the way up to transitioning workers in the existing workforce, because much as though there's a key element for the young, 80% of tomorrow's workforce is in the workforce of today. And we've got a massive education, skills and training agenda that many people have picked up in the questions in the chat.
Good, smashing. Right, what we're going to do now is go over to Caitlin, and Caitlin's a Scottish colleague who's the branch chair of the Glasgow Hospitality branch, and Caitlin will give an account of what they're doing there, and also if you could just remind people of the wee conference you've got during COP26. Caitlin, over to Govanhill.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, I'm Caitlin Lee. I'm the chair of Unite Hospitality and Services in Glasgow. So when discussing a just transition for workers, I believe that this must be centred around all industries and to focus on real change that creates a different work life for all. For a just transition to stay true to its roots, it must include more than simply greener jobs in certain industries. It's about far more than that. It's social inclusion, eradicating poverty and ensuring decent work for all whilst tackling the climate issue. As mentioned, I'm based in Glasgow. This is a city that industrially was decimated during Thatcher. This left working class people behind, and the implications of that can still be seen. This was due to a government that didn't have workers as a priority and attempted to decimate the power of unions and their members. The callous, abhorrent policies and shift that happened still has a grip on parts of Scotland like Glasgow. Most recently, with the COVID pandemic, it again was working class people in precarious industries that were exploited, put in danger. And what we experienced in hospitality in 2020 was an industry of highly skilled workers, again, decimated with mass redundancies throughout the UK. This happening all the while multinational companies like Amazon and the richest in society got richer. So this is why a just transition now for workers with the climate emergency is so important. We are facing what will be momentum momentum changes to industries. And if all workers and trade unions aren't at the forefront demanding better, we simply won't get it. The implication of a transition without a fair and just transition for workers will have an effect, like I mentioned, of Glasgow, but this will be on a global scale, and the implications are worldwide, and the gaps in wealth will increase. With this issue, I do think it is important to highlight that it is the poorest affected. They are exploited and left behind in both their work and lives. So any conversation or conference must focus around the global issue of this and ensure solidarity with workers globally is a priority. I'm myself looking at this vast issue and trying to find a solution that fits all globally and almost feeling like it isn't possible. That is why the impact of conferences like this, focusing on the just transition and stressing the fact it's workers-led, helps, as it gives us, the workers, autonomy, which in any situation where you feel lack of control is vital. So what I think is important when discussing the just transition is that workers feel this autonomy about their own future and feel empowered to push for it. It's ensuring that workers have the power to demand better and see that it is possible. A just transition must contain elements of eradicating precarious work as well as moving greener. So better wages for all industries, ensuring that there are no more labels of low skilled. We as workers know our worth and will have no more of the myth that some industries or jobs are less than highly skilled. All workers are skilled, and with that it's important to stress that all skills are transferable, so no mass amount of losses should be seen. This is where, as members, I believe we need to be demanding as a collective for better in this transition. What I want to see from a just transition is a move away from carbon intensive industries, but to ensure that marginalised workers are included. We must use this opportunity as workers and trade unionists to demand a transition that addresses inequalities in our workforce. That as we know, women, migrants and racialised groups are far more exposed to unfit conditions, precarious work and toxic, dangerous work environments. So this is an element of the just transition that must be front and centre of any policy. If we look historically and even up to the current global pandemic, we know that it is these workers that are affected the most by poor policy decisions and poor employers. So let's not make the same conscious decisions again and make this transition fit for all. An example of this power of workers collectively demanding better and using the transition can be seen in Glasgow right now. We as a city are set to host COP26, which is possibly the single most important event Glasgow will ever hold for the city and for the world. But we as a city have severe issues and workers are voicing concerns in the state of the city and its cleanliness. This currently is being met with contempt, but it isn't changing the resolve of those highlighting issues. This is because with a collective and looking at how important this event to us, we can leverage those in power. However, trade unions in Glasgow and community groups are continuing to demand better for our city. And it's not just for the 2 weeks of COP26 until the delegates and presidents have left. This is long-term changes that are being demanded to improve our city to be greener, cleaner and fairer. And if it wasn't for trade unions demanding it and highlighting it, this conversation wouldn't be happening. Our branch, the Glasgow Hospitality and Services branch, is holding a fringe event about COP26 and fair hospitality. And we are using it to demand better for our members and our industry. Now, I know hospitality might not seem like the most relevant, but all industries are. And to use this example helps to show that the just transition means an end to exploitative and unfair employment. Like the Unite Charter regarding the just transition, we have our own hospitality one, and it aims to eradicate some of the many predatory and exploitative practices that will ultimately make our industry better. To use an international event when Glasgow is at the forefront is to, one, hold companies account that neglect and mistreat their employees on a global scale. And then secondly, demand better and use international solidarity, the exorbitant financial gain that Glasgow and companies are making right now with COP26, and using the collective of workers that are in the industry that is now not fit for sustainability of both staff and a new just world. These workers are in some of the lowest paid and most precarious 0-hour contracts, and these are workers that are standing up against the biggest hotel chains and event companies, and they're winning better treatment. What can start from fighting against an unfair redundancy can and has changed companies to adopt living wage and the Fair Hospitality Charter. So these successes and the strength of workers in hospitality shows as a collective of workers, we can change industries and should have a seat at the table, as we know our industries best and know how to create positive change. So these kind of demands can be done by all workers in all industries. So when you take away the almost impossible mammoth task that is the just transition and work as a collective, the reality of this change is possible. To do this, we need to be empowered. We need workers engaged, leading reps in all industries, and education courses on our industries and the changes that are going to happen. Unite, along with the members like our Glasgow branch, are pushing for this change that is coming, but the autonomy and drive is with us, the workers. We are the workers that know what our industries need, and in this next change, we must push forward for it. So the idea of a just transition, of course, started in trade unions with the plan to put workers at the forefront of fair change for their industries. So we are the experts and deserve this change so that there will be no more exploitative contracts, poverty wages, fair new green jobs for highly skilled workers. And the best way to drive this change is through our collectives. Right, thank you.
Absolutely smashing, Caitlin. That's what we need, more Caitlins in every town, city and village. And it represents, I think, the core of Unite, and that is based on the strength of the lay members in the workplace. Right, I see there's a real nest of questions flashing in. I'm going to ask Colin to pick up the question on hydrogen, because there's a number of questions on that. And I'm going to ask Colin to be brief, because we're bringing in Sean Sweeney from New York at 10:20. Colin?
I will certainly try and do my best. I'm trying to keep up with the actual questions as I'm going through them. With regard to hydrogen, there is several sources of hydrogen, as we're all aware. There's which we colour code. Blue hydrogen basically means it's hydrogen derived from natural gas. Green hydrogen derived from electrolysis and other methodologies which does not produce any CO2. There's grey, there's black, there's green, there's gold, there's all sorts of colours that we refer to different methodologies of generating hydrogen. In general, we support any method that does not produce large volumes of CO2 entering our atmosphere. Grey hydrogen does that, so does black, and so does brown, where you're actually extracting it from fossil fuels and emitting the CO2 that's produced into the atmosphere. We certainly don't support that methodology. We need to see methods which only generate hydrogen which is sustainable, and that's the way we want to see the methods going forward. Hope that quickly answers everything that could possibly generate in that situation. All right. Okay,
smashing, Colin. That was first class. Steve?
Yeah, Jim, I just think there's a number of things, like from Caitlin's perspective. One, I just think it's an issue that she emphasizes. A number of different sectors are going to benefit from this, and a number are going to face quite direct impacts. And I think the control around how we address all of this, as she's identified, is that we have ownership of it. And I think the language is important because, you know, as she's clearly identified, we need to redefine the narrative on what we mean by just, you know, what does justice mean in this context? I think the second thing is it's very much about individuals. We can look at this very complex issue as Caitlin's identified and be overawed by it, but we can't. We've been at the head as unions of industrial change to a number of industrial revolutions in the past. They've gone, we're still here, and we intend to be going forward. I think one of the other things is just identifying that we need a joined upness to this, both within our industrial structures, but across our sectors. Some sectors are at the leading edge of industrial change, and I include AI in this as well. And others will not be as far advanced in relation to their trade group experience. So there's a big issue, as Caitlin mentioned, about sharing this, about making this collective, sharing best practice so that we learn from each other. And I think one of the key things you've said, Jim, and again, Caitlin identified, and so did Siobhan, is we don't know all the answers yet, but we've got to find solutions together. And that's come through on the chats and also through some of the questions as well. And I'd just ask other colleagues on the panel if there's anything else that they would pick up and identify from what Caitlin's mentioned in a short piece before we go into Sean.
We'll pick up the retrofitting. This is an enormous task. You talk about 23 to 28 million gas heating boilers having to be taken out and the place re-insulated. Not only is it expensive, but I see in the chat people identifying there's not enough workers, and that's why we're emphasising there needs to be a skills revolution. We need to think through how we're going to get people trained up, and with a gender balance, and it gives an opportunity for us to force through a workforce that's really representative of the communities in which they engage. Incidentally, I know, because I'm 3 days older than grass, I know that this can be done because it was done when in 1960, 1972, when we moved from municipal gas. That's how you see these great big gasometers all over the country. That used to produce gas locally from coal, and it was then transferred to North Sea oil, which Tony will talk about after the tea break. But that was an enormous change, and that was done because we brought in armies of workers to do that. And that's a challenge the government face. It's also in that challenge, it's opportunities for us as a union, in concert with other unions and organisations, to get people into good paid jobs. That's going to be a big debate. And one of the areas where we are quite strong is in social housing, which Siobhan's the National Secretary for. And Caitlin's main message, I think, really is the individual sisters and brothers at the workplace should be taking control. This isn't an issue for the high hegians in the union. This is an issue for people in their workplace. And our job is to help give them the tools so they can put forward those cases cogently and win the arguments. That's the message I take from Caitlin. And I'm using Caitlin as a really good example of how ordinary members, they're not ordinary, members can just take that initiative and win those arguments. And that's why we had Caitlin on today. Now, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to bring in Sean Sweeney. Sean's based in New York, and he's part of Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. And Sean brings a different perspective, a global perspective and an ideological perspective. And incidentally, if you go online to TUED, it's a massive of resources, wonderful resources, articulate and academically strong resources available for you there. Sean, thanks for joining us. I know it's very early in the morning and you've got to leave us to do your newspaper round in about 2 hours. So on you go.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, comrades. And I congratulate Unite and the task force for existing and for raising the whole level of the conversation to where it needs to be. I mean, for so long, we've been, as a movement, really in the background of the whole climate discussions. My involvement in this, if I may start on a personal note, was in 2007 when I started to realize, like a lot of people, that the climate emergency is not just has to be addressed, but the current policy or the policies at that time and that continue today, which is about mobilizing the private sector in order to guarantee risk investment, that they weren't going to work. And in 2009, I did a project when I was at Cornell University for the United Nations Environment Program. They said, we need a study on green jobs, and there's not been one produced that looks at it at a global level. So working with unions, we spent a year trying to develop this program, this paper. And I remember writing the conclusion where I said, these jobs are not going to be created either in terms of numbers or in terms of quality without public ownership of key sectors. We just talking this morning or this afternoon, I think it is, or late morning your time, about the question of retrofits. And the way it landed was that the United Nations Environment Program says, no, we can't say anything that might discourage private investors. So that was my first direct encounter with this kind of thinking. But I wanted to, because I've been to about 10 COPs, 26 is in Glasgow is going to be, I think, particularly important for a number of reasons. First of all, the unions in the UK have a very, especially, and I think particularly in Scotland, I may be overstating that, but Scotland's top line, the STUC's top line messages for COP26 are right on target in terms of public buses, the retrofit, and the renewable sector. And this is exactly what we're trying to work on with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. We're working very closely with the CGT affiliated unions in France who are in the energy sector, who have successfully for now fought off the privatization or the full breakup of EDF, the national utility. Now, what we've been trying to highlight in our global work, which I think will come out in Glasgow, is the really the kind of sneaky way, the dominant narrative around mobilizing the private sector and climate protection have gone together. It's basically being fused together. Some of us are old enough to remember the structural adjustment programs that were inflicted on the global south, places like Mexico and Venezuela and Brazil and elsewhere in the 1980s and 1990s, where the International Monetary Fund told countries, because they were suffering high inflation, that if they wanted an emergency loan, they would have to sell off their entire public sector. And the results were, they call it the lost decades. In fact, the last 3 or 4 decades, it was absolutely disastrous. And it started in Chile in 1973 with the Pinochet regime. And it was an experiment to sell off public services. Now, what's that got to do with climate change? What's that got to do with today's debate? Yesterday, I had a conversation with the Chilean unions, and there is a document that the Chilean government has sent to Glasgow, well, sent to the United Nations, that mentions the term just transition 24 times in its proposals to meet its climate obligations, but it mentions workers 0 times. So what we're seeing is the term is being used as a way of further privatizations, particularly of the power sector. And so our job as unions is to say further privatizations is not only unacceptable, but what we need in order to decarbonize, that's the word of the hour, to decarbonize both the power sector and the transport sectors and the building sector, is we need a public works and public goods approach to the control over the energy system. The arguments we have, but we won't win this battle on the strength of our arguments alone. It sounds like such a heavy lift that so many trade unionists all around the world feel that they will not be successful, that we're just trying to get the crumbs off of the table. And I think that's a mistake, because what we are is clear over the last 20 years of all the speeches made about climate protection, all the conventions, we still have rising emissions. In 2019, emissions were at record levels. And this is since 1990, when the UN started talking about climate change and raised it as an issue. Emissions globally have gone up by 60 or 70%. It's an astonishing statistic that the emissions keep going up. The energy use keeps going up, particularly of coal, oil, and gas. So to take charge of this situation is not calling for leaders to, commit to more ambition, because what we've seen over the last several years since the Paris Agreement, and because of the climate movement, we've seen the levels of ambition have actually gone up. So you've got China saying we're going to be net zero emissions by 2060. The United States wants to be net zero in the power sector by 2035. So you've got all of these speeches, but the actions are completely contrary to the message coming from the mouths of politicians. So where do we land on this? And then I'll sum up. Essentially, we have to say a just transition needs, first and foremost, a transition. If we're not in control over the emissions levels, we will not be able to make life palatable or acceptable for working class communities. Yes, there are a lot of changes going on in the economy, a lot of green stuff out there, but you have to weigh it up in terms of what is going on with the current expansion of energy use globally, which is absolutely phenomenal, which is why the retrofits program is so very, very important. So the emphasis, I think, or one of the things that I'm really excited about Glasgow is that unions, comrades in Scotland and elsewhere, and Unite is right on top of this issue, is the necessity for reclaiming energy to public ownership. That may sound like a heavy lift, but it's absolutely essential if we're going to have full decarbonization of the power sector. And if we don't have the decarbonization of the power sector, then the chances of taking emissions out of transport and buildings is going to be very, very difficult indeed. I'll end on a positive note, though, because 5 years ago, I was in Mexico. 4 years ago, I was in Mexico City, and I met with the unions there in the energy sector, and they were totally despondent that anything was possible. 2 years later, they elected Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the government of Morena. A new party came onto the scene. They won in the first round of the Mexican elections. Their victory was so large, even the right wing that steals elections routinely in Mexico couldn't get away with it. They came into office. The first thing they said was energy self-determination. They stopped the privatization of the grid. They have introduced measures to renationalize the grid, to stop the offshore oil and gas exploration of the big US multinationals. They have now just recently announced a massive public solar program in Mexico with regional and national governments financing and partnering together. This would have been inconceivable 4 or 5 years ago. I think not only is that example encouraging, but it shows that what we can put forward in Glasgow and how unions, great unions like Unite, can work alongside other comrades and put forward a similarly bold agenda. Because what we're seeing now is, yes, there's a climate emergency, but the current policy is completely incapable of dealing with it. That's been the experience for the last 20 years. We need to take charge of the transition in order for it to be a just transition. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Jim, and thanks, comrades. And hello from New York. It's still dark here.
Jim,
thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean, very much. And we're going to come back to you. I just want to say something. There's tons of questions flowing in. We're going to answer all the questions. We're going to take as many questions and respond to them on screen. But those that were unable to, because of time constraints, we'll answer that. We'll write them all up. We'll send you all the questions and we'll give you all the responses. So I know it's a wee bit frustrating, but that's the dynamic. It's a good indication that this is an interactive process. Now, it'd be good if we could just take questions relating to what Sean has just contributed. So who wants to come in with the question and response to Sean's contribution, please? Is that Siobhan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I can come in now, Jim. Just a really quick question to Sean, because I think one of the things that we've seen Trade Unions for Energy Democracy be able to do is to provide that political context in relation to the need for public ownership of energy, but also to be able to bring our global movement together, to be able to bring together the trade unions from the global south and the global north, and to put a perspective around a just transition. And I know also Trade Unions for Energy Democracy did an excellent amount of work during the pandemic to bring trade unions together in relation to that as well. How we build back, I mean, people say build back better, don't they? How we rebuild our economy in a post-pandemic world while having climate change and a just transition at its heart is something that TUED have done a huge amount of work on. But I just think it's really important that you've been able to bring trade unions from all parts of our world together. And I just wondered if you could comment on that, Sean.
Well, I think, thank you, Siobhan, and thanks for all the work you're doing on this issue. I mean, I think when we started Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, it's become a very interesting story because we convened in New York after what was called the Rio +20 conference. It was the Earth conference 20 years afterwards, and that was 2012. And there was a big debate among the unions there. And there were 400, if I may spend a minute just to tell this story, there were 400 unions in the hall in Rio de Janeiro. And the message coming from some of the unions in the global north, who were more on the conservative side, was, oh, well, we got to go along with this green growth model. Because if we have green growth, that means jobs and just transition and social dialogue. So this was the sort of global narrative. And most of the unions there from Brazil, Argentina, Chile were absolutely incensed, saying, we need to understand that this green growth agenda is tied to an extremely repressive set of policies that are forcing greenness down our throats, but it's really supported by wind and solar multinationals from around the world, as well as every green technology company you can imagine. There is not a single solar panel in the world today that has been installed without public money. There's not a single windmill in the world today. And I am not, this sounds like over the top exaggeration, but it's not a single piece of renewable energy technology that has basically been installed on a market basis. It's all been subsidized. There's nothing wrong with subsidizing good things, but at the end of the day, it's moving public money to the hands of private investors, to the hands of private companies. So unions in Brazil and Argentina and Latin America understood that. So we convened a meeting and said, what are we going to do about this narrative? Because narrative is so important. It's how workers understand things. It's how people in the street understand things. So we convened in 2012 and we were in New York 2 weeks after a hurricane. 2 weeks later, Hurricane Sandy, devastated the city and killed 40 people. And there was a blackout for weeks. So it was a timely reminder of what we were doing. And we said, we have to fight for public ownership of energy and we have to bring unions together from around the world. But, and this is, I think, the important observation we made at the time is we are all energy unions now. Even if we're not in the energy sector, the fact that it's the energy system that is primarily responsible for CO2 emissions. And if we can include transport in the energy system because it's basically all goes back to oil extraction. So energy, we are all energy users. We're all, in fact, living under the same atmosphere, which, as we know, is this fragile ecosystem. We all have a say in how the transition to a low carbon future should be brought about. But we must face the reality, and that is the transition is not inevitable. If you listen to some of our own comrades sometimes in the trade union movement at the global level, they start talking as though it's well underway, everything's going according to plan. All we need is a seat at the table and some jobs and some social just transition. And it's not true. So we have to be clear. The reason why there's a climate emergency is the 25 years of neoliberal pro-market policies have been a complete disaster in terms of addressing. So we need workers of all countries to unite around this question. The Global South has a particularly important role to play because in China and India today, this is where most of the new emissions coming into the system is from the Global South. So the struggle has to be taken up there. But that doesn't exonerate the Global North because they've been, first of all, they are responsible for 2/3 to 3/4 of the carbon dioxide that is currently warming the planet has been generated by places like the US, the UK, and then the Global North in general. So these emissions are very active in the climate, and they're going to be active for the next 100 years or longer. So we all have a responsibility as workers all over the world to address this. And Siobhan, I think touching on the question of international involvement and solidarity is so crucial, but it cannot be an exchange of t-shirts. It has to be a programmatic solidarity based around clear ideas about what we want a worker's future, what workers want in terms of a sustainable and low carbon future, because we can do it, because we put common sense first. We put need before profit. And I was inspired when I was a kid by and I'll close on this, by the whole discussion around Lucas Aerospace and how workers and the shop stewards put together their plan. I was so inspired by the Upper Clyde shipbuilders struggle in the early 70s. And I think this is exactly the kind of audacity that we need. And if we act, not just demonstrate, not just call for more ambition from our leaders, but we act in a decisive way, it will capture the imagination of workers all over the planet, and the environmental and climate movement will support us. At the moment, we're trailing them, and they should be working alongside us in terms of putting forward bold demands for the future. Thanks for that question, Siobhan.
And thank you, Sean, but we're not leaving it there. Carol, would you like to come in, please?
Yes, thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Sean, I think you've kind of alluded to it, but in particular, I would like you to explain TU Ed's critique on just transition, because in particular, the information that the alternative approach that was incorporated in your work in paper 13.
If comrades don't mind giving me another minute or two, I just feel like I'm hogging the microphone here.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carl, for that question. And thanks for reading the paper, by the way. A lot of people sometimes say, oh, I can't read a paper. It's too many, it's that long. What we did in that paper, it's called Unions and Just Transition, a Search for a Transformative Politics. It basically said that the current debate at the global level in the trade unions, which is the ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation, I'm sure you know, is frames that debate. And they see it as an opportunity to get a seat at the table, to be part of the transition to a low carbon future, to encourage the private sector to invest in job creation. There's nothing wrong with any of this. If it succeeds, of course, it won't succeed. So the critique that we offered is saying that we cannot have a just transition unless we can take control over key economic sectors, and particularly the power sector, which we think is the most crucial involved in that. The other thing we sort of argued is saying, look, social dialogue as a global ideology for the labor movement has become a neurotic obsession. But the only people who are obsessed by it are some of the union officials who go to various conferences, because the employers don't care about social dialogue. This is the idea that comes out of the European Union, the Treaty of Rome of 1958, that we would be partners along with governments and employers in building a new world. Of course, that was 1958. It might have looked more possible then. Fast forward to 2021, and we're seeing, we know, everybody in this call knows, workers' rights and protections are being trampled on all over the world. So what's the point of saying, oh, we agree with your agenda of green growth, we agree with your transition, but just please give us a seat at the table? It's, to use a sexy term, it's disempowering for workers, disempowering for unions to be waiting on Richard Branson to give us a seat at the table. It's absolutely appalling. So if we don't get pretty angry about this politics, then our movement will be basically lulled, as it already has been, into falling off the cliff of the green growth myth, because it's not going to happen. So I think, Carl, and I would welcome even more discussion on what we said in that paper, but we transposed, or rather counterposed, the social dialogue approach with a social power approach. Without power, there won't be an opportunity to engage employers from a level of strength. So what we've got is a symbolic seat at the table that doesn't even matter very much. So we feel that we have to build power. Of course, everybody in the trade union movement says we need to build power. How do we do that? One of the things we have to do is, when we're talking about the climate crisis, is to show not just the failure of the current model, but how an alternative can be done. If we put worker skills together, the commitment of working class people to have a clean environment, they want that. Of course, we want it for our families, our kids, and everything else. We can put forward that vision, but it has to be technically literate. We cannot just say, well, we want a different future based on, human solidarity and sufficiency. Yes, we do. But how do we do it? How do we stop the fact that 50 billion or whatever, 50 million metric tons or whatever it is of CO2 in the atmosphere is being created every year, and it's piling on year on year on year, and it's cooking the planet? So we need to say, how do we address that? What are the practical proposals? And that's why, and I'll conclude on this, the emphasis on public transport by the Scottish TUC is so important. We've got the emphasis on retrofitting buildings, because buildings are 40% of CO2 emissions. This is the kind of practical proposals that we can rally workers around, but it also gives us an opportunity to answer that question of what does a transition look like, and what a workers-led transition could look like. So thank you for your question, Carl, and thanks for reading the paper.
Jackson?
It's actually my comment stroke question for Sean is based on that last remark, actually, about a worker-led transition. When we've chosen in Scotland to focus in COP26 on the public transport and retrofitting issues, because they are examples of where workers could recognise that just transition would be beneficial to their jobs, to job creation, rather than some of the other suggestions which people are, understandably frightful of in terms of what it means for their jobs. But I think I'm interested in going beyond that, quite frankly. I think Sean's absolutely correct about the question of public ownership and an alternative at that level to changing, the free market agenda. But I think we also need democracy at the workplace. And Sean has mentioned about Lucas Aerospace, etc. I see there's a couple of questions and comments in the chat. I'm quite keen in trying to develop a new Lucas plan or plans. We've already had some discussions with some of the shop stewards at Rolls-Royce, but it seems to me that the building of combines, workers themselves coming up with ideas and alternative production, taking control of this agenda is how we link this agenda to the building of workers' power, and indeed to bargaining demands, shorter working week with no loss of pay, etc., etc. So I'd be interested to hear from Sean how TUED might be able to put us in contact with other combines on a global level. I know that sounds ambitious, but some of the companies that I'm mentioning are part of a global chain, and it will only really be effective if they link up with other trade unionists in other areas of the world. So I don't know, Sean, whether TUED is able to assist in that process, but I do think that a worker-led transition needs to look at the question of industrial democracy.
If I may, Jim, I think that's a question we should have put some hours aside in Glasgow and talk about how we do that, because I think you're right on target with that. We know that the sort of the workers' control movement, workers' cooperatives movement has been in a bad state now for a number of decades. But if there's ever a time to bring that tradition back into light, back into visibility, it is now. Because I'll just give an example of in the US, they just did a utility scale battery project that for something like 400 megawatts in California burst into flames. And it's like, yeah, if any of the workers or the technicians involved in that had any say in the design of that system, the chances of that happen, I think, would have been a lot less. So we also, I think where it comes in, Jackson, in the climate debate is everybody's looking for the next technological fix, whether it be carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. I mean, someone behind a computer designing a big machine to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, it looks perfect. It's so easy to do, of course, because you're doing it with a piece of software. Actually doing it in real life, or actually, putting those technologies into practice is really an invitation to workers to say, let's get involved in designing and creating some of these technologies. Let's partner with the progressive research and development community, because there are many people who work for companies, they're getting a paycheck from the companies, understand a lot of these technologies are completely speculative. They're a way of getting long-term subsidies from government. They do a pilot project somewhere. And unfortunately, I think carbon capture and storage is a good example of that. They'll do a pilot project close to the North Sea, where you can bury CO2 in basically in underground cavities. Yes, thank you for that, Jim. It's still a bit early here, but of course, most of the power stations in the world are nowhere near a storage facility, so they're not near an ocean. They're in the middle of China or in the middle of India. So how are we going to get carbon capture from power stations that are 10 years old in India? Not 50, 60 years old. So these are the kind of technical questions that I think a new workers' control movement could engage in. And I think we could start that in Glasgow. Let's lay out some plans to bring unions around the world together on the issues of technologies and how workers can work together and be a global brain trust of skills and knowledge that we can use, because one day we're going to be in a situation where we can implement these policies. And that may seem a long way off now, but we know how quickly things can change in today's world. And a few more pandemics and climate disasters, and we might be in a completely different situation. So Jackson, I'm all in, comrade. Let's talk about that in Glasgow.